Well, welcome and good evening. My name is Paul Grant. I'm an associate professor of political science at Georgia Gwinnett College. And I want to thank you for joining us this evening for a wonderful presentation that's going to be presented. And as advertised, it is Oscarville, a city buried under Lake Lanier. Well, many U.S. metropolitan areas have a well-known place where residents enjoy water sports and outdoor recreation in the summer. New York has Coney Island, Chicago has Lake Michigan, Los Angeles is famous for Venice Beach, Minneapolis has a chain of lakes, and our good friends up in Charlotte enjoy the river. And I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation, but I think it's Catawba River. But anyway, citizens enjoy water recreation in the metro area in these places. And we in Metro Atlanta also have a well-known body of water. But in addition to being known for water sports and outdoor recreation, our summer destination of choice, Lake Lanier, has a history which is both tragic and a source of myth and superstition. Oscarville was a prosperous African-American city in the early 1900s. After the murder of a white woman in Forsyth County, its Black residents had to flee from white terrorists to Hall County and other locations. Later, the U.S. government created Lake Lanier on what was Oscarville. Now, some insist the treatment of Oscarville's Black residents and the flooding of the town has made Lake Lanier haunted and is the cause of numerous tragic accidents that occur in the lake every summer. This evening, Ron Gauthier will share some of his research on the history of Oscarville and the racial cleansing of Black residents by Forsyth County white terrorists. He will also address the belief, held by some, that Lake Lanier is actually haunted. I think we can all talk about that one. Well, let me tell you a little bit about Ron. Ronald M. Gauthier is a library branch manager in the Gwinnett County Public Library System, where he's been employed for over 16 and a half years. He's been actively involved in outreach, community partnership building, and his program planning for the library has impacted numerous demographics categories and citizens and residents throughout Gwinnett County. In 2018, he devised and implemented a Black History program for Bay Creek Middle School, targeting 8th graders and their teachers. And the program has been so successful that subsequently it's been expanded to more middle schools as well as high schools, and is offered both in person and virtually. Prior to working in libraries, both in New Orleans, Louisiana, and Gwinnett County, Georgia, Ron has taught adult education courses and was an employment job readiness counselor and instructor. Ron holds a BA in English from Southern University, a master's in counseling and adult education from Xavier University, and a master's of library and information science from Louisiana State University. And with that, let me go ahead and ask Mr. Gauthier to begin his excellent presentation. We're going to learn a lot this evening. Ron, please go ahead and get started.
Good evening, and thank you for that introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm very excited to be here tonight to share the story of the origins of Oscarville, Georgia. So as we know, there are stories of multiple missing persons, which is factual, in Lake Lanier, But also, there are also stories of the supernatural and the paranormal, visions of ghosts that are floating around the body of the water, and people claim to have been reached from inside the water and sucked down. So what we will do is this. We'll focus on some of the facts that we know, and we'll leave the ghosts, goblins, and so on and so forth to maybe a team of Ghostbusters who could join us at another time. But let's talk about the city of Oscarville, Georgia, where it was located. So a good thing to do is to know exactly where is it located now in Forsyth County, Georgia. So if you look at the map I have available for you, Lake Lanier is right outside of Cummins and sort of like the southeastern side of Forsyth County. Oscarville, Georgia, the city that we will talk about, is primarily under Lake Lanier. So we'll talk about the origins of Oscarville, Georgia, and we'll also talk about Lake Lanier and how it came into being. So we'll talk about the racial expulsion that occurred in 1912 in Forsyth County. But one of the things I'd like you to know is that that wasn't the first incident of a racial cleansing in Forsyth. In 1838, the Cherokee Nation, Native Americans, were actually forcibly removed from Forsyth County. They moved to what was called the Indian Territory, which is now called Oklahoma. So we had these incidences very early in our community. So Georgia was really an outlier in the community. Georgia was a place that saw remarkable social experiments during Reconstruction. So we'll start with the slavery time. Georgia, just like any other southern state, had a large slave population, and Forsyth County had one as well. But following slavery and going into Reconstruction, that's when we would see some amazing advancements in terms of African-American civil rights in Georgia. So let's walk backwards just a bit so we can talk about some of the things that occurred that led to these major changes. So during Sherman's March to the Sea, the famous March to the Sea, his army approached an area called Ebenezer Creek, which was about 20 miles out of Savannah, Georgia. Now, his army and crew with their engineers had the ability to erect, when they needed it, a pontoon bridge. And a pontoon bridge, as you see in the picture, is a bridge that could be erected overnight with the skill of the engineers and then suddenly removed. Now, remember that Sherman was undergoing a very difficult time because as his army marched during their blazing battle and their scorched to the earth march to the sea, they were also experiencing a slowdown with a large number of African-American slaves who were following their army. So at one point, when the army approached the pontoon bridge and they knew that the ex-Confederates were closely behind them, they decided to move across the bridge, not allow the slaves to follow them. So they pulled the bridge apart. So many of the slaves fell into the water and drowned. Some of them were left on the other side of the bank and unfortunately were captured by the ex-Confederates. Or I'm sorry, I'm saying ex-Confederates, Confederates. We'll get to Reconstruction in a moment. So one of the reporters, who was also a commander in the army, actually wrote about his experiences and sent that to the media in Washington, D.C. This made its way to William Stanton, who was the Secretary of War at the time. William Stanton took a train down to Savannah and met with General William T. Sherman. And he asked him about the incident, this horrible experience that these slaves endured. So Sherman explained the difficulty that his army and many Union armies were facing throughout the South, that suddenly they were followed by this large number of people who they could not care for. They were slowing down their lines. They didn't have enough provisions for them, water, food, or medication, and they just weren't sure what to do. Now, he did not actually sanction the removal of the pontoon bridge, and not much came out of that, but another conversation started. What do you do with these ex-slaves who were referred to then as contraband? So Sherman met in 1864 in Savannah, Georgia, with 20 leaders of the African-American community. And they asked him essentially, what did they want? What would you like to do with your new freedom? So one of the men who spoke on behalf of the group was 67-year-old Charles Frazier, who was an ex-slave. And he told him that they wanted land that was tillable, land that they could use to take care of themselves, land so that they could raise livestock, hunt, fish, and take care of their families. Now, Sherman is a strategist, and there was some news. There was actually some available land. There was some land confiscated from the Confederates in the southeastern part of the United States, from North Carolina, right on the coast, all the way down through Georgia, down to parts of Florida, 400,000 acres of land. So Sherman's idea was to redistribute that land to these ex-slaves who were following him, and that way they could build their lives on that land, start over, and he would be free of them following him. So William Stanton agreed to it. They redistributed to the land to the ex-slaves, and they gave them 40-acre plots each. This is where the term 40 acres and a mule actually originates from. So they got 40 acres each for a family and a mule. And Sherman was able to march continuously on to the Carolinas to finish the campaign. Now, keep in mind, this was an amazing experience because this was the first time in Georgia that was an actual act of redistribution of land to ex-slaves, reparations. So not surprisingly, we would see the birth of the Freedmen's Bureau during Reconstruction. So we would see schools open for the very first time in the South. We would see different social service agencies combined with the Freedmen's Bureau and open schools and educate African-American slaves. We'd actually find the Freedmen's Bureau doing some other amazing things, working as closely with them as they can to ensure that they had food, clothing, shelter. And if there was a conflict dispute or worker contract, the ex-slaves had the opportunity to take that conflict to the Freedmen's Bureau and have an agent resolve it for them. So now let's get into Abraham Lincoln, assassinated in 1865. His vice president, Andrew Johnson, becomes the president of the United States. And I don't think I need to tell you, he was not a friend of the ex-slave. Johnson wanted the ex-Confederates to have a very easy return into the Union, and he didn't believe in civil rights for the ex-slaves. And one of the other things Johnson did, unfortunately, was Lincoln had actually signed off on Special Field Order 15, which was the official name of 40 acres and a mule. Johnson, when he became president, he rescinded that. So that land had to go back. It was an extraordinary experiment, something amazing in terms of the sociology of helping people regain their lives, but it was very short-lived. So we had these other positive things occurring, though. We know that Johnson would be in office one term. Ulysses S. Grant, the former general of the Army of the North, would become the president of the United States. And amazing legislation would pass in conjunction with the help from the radical Republicans who were in Congress. So one of those we know is in 1870, the 15th Amendment. We had the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, and then the 15th Amendment. So now we've got African Americans voting for the very first time. We've got schools open throughout the South. So it was a good start with lots of beginnings and just amazing, amazing opportunities. Okay, there we are. Here's some of the schools in Georgia. And I have to remind my my students when I share this with them, remember, African Americans were the only racial group in this country legally forbidden to read and write. So this was an extraordinary experience that in 1865, with the help of the Freedmen's Bureau and other benevolent associations, they were actually going to school for the first time. Okay. And of course, we know this led to one of the most magnificent experiences in American history, the first Black members of the United States Congress. We had men like, most importantly, Jefferson Long, who was here from Georgia. And Jefferson Long, as we know, as a slave, worked as a tailor. And his tailor shop was located directly across the street from an auction block. And there's Jefferson Taylor. He was the first African-American to speak on the United States House of Representatives floor. When Frederick Douglass saw him enter the Capitol, he said, "Here before us stands the flesh and blood example of civil rights for African-Americans." Okay. And then there were other leaders, part of the original 13 African-American politicians elected in the South, in Georgia specifically, 33 of them. And most of those were local level politicians, Tunis Campbell, Mr. O'Neill, and so many, many others. Okay. And as we know the story with the original 33, some of these men, unfortunately, were expelled. Okay. They sued, took the case all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and many of them were reinstated. The 14th Amendment had passed not long ago, and the Supreme Court realized that these were now citizens. Now, if you look at the statue, this is available over at the state capitol in downtown Atlanta. There is a statue that's erected to pay homage to these men and the work that they accomplished. There are those statues. So let's talk about a reverse now. We saw all of this great development and these great opportunities for the ex-slaves. So one of the things we know about are the Black codes that occurred in 1865, and which laws were passed to severely restrict the movement of ex-slaves and deny them the opportunity to really survive in the mainstream society. One of the worst, of course, was the convict leasing system, in which African-American men mainly would be imprisoned, sentenced, and a form of slavery could still exist. They would be sold to mining camps, work on city capital works projects. Many of them would be sold to plantations. So it was a way for re-enslavement to actually exist. And then we would see close to the 1880s to the 1890s, many state legislation and city legislation that would actually find a way to circumvent the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. One of those was the grandfather clause. And in the grandfather clause, which was ridiculous upon its entire concept, was that if your grandfather was born in this country and voted prior to 1867, then all of his lineal descendants are qualified to vote. This was important because this meant that a large number of African Americans would not qualify whatsoever. And not surprisingly, in 1915, the NAACP in its very first Supreme Court case would overturn the grandfather clause. Then there was the literacy test. Okay, people were required to take the literacy test. You had to pass the literacy test. And the test was based on whatever the voter registrar decided you needed to pass. Now, bear in mind that the literacy test came first, the grandfather clause after, because the literacy test also discriminated against poor white people who could not read and write. The grandfather clause was used to eliminate the literacy test, and it was another provision you could use. And then, of course, there were the poll taxes. You had to pay to vote. How many people could afford that at that time? In many cases, the poll tax could be equivalent to a full day's wages. And then, of course, there was the well-known all-white primary that originated actually out of Texas. And essentially, you had the primary party, and then you also had the general election. So the primary party voted in a primary election. So the primary party really determined exactly who that elected official would be. And unfortunately, the primary party systematically excluded African Americans from membership. So we found these new laws originating throughout the South, and it was circumventing just about everything those great amendments were designed to do to advance people. And then the riots that were occurring in the South. Of course, we know of the major riot in 1906 in Atlanta, Georgia, where a large number of very angry people stormed into the city, attacking African Americans and Black businesses. And now let's go to Oscarville, Georgia. So in spite of the advancements, followed by, unfortunately, the backsliding and regression, African Americans in Oscarville, Georgia were doing quite well. So you had a population of almost 2,000, about 1,900, okay? 58 of those people, of those families, actually owned their own property. So they weren't sharecroppers, they weren't tenement farmers, they weren't working for anybody, they actually owned their own land. They had schools, they were very successful, and things were going great for a while. They worked on their own plantations. They had their own farms. Some of them worked in rural plantations like many other Blacks throughout the South, but they made a pretty decent living in this environment, this small, close community. Then one day there was a horrible incident. An 18-year-old woman named May Crow was beaten, her body left in a ditch, and she was allegedly raped. So when this occurred in the Old South, the job of the community was to find out who this was, no matter what. Word got out that it was a Black male, a young Black male, 18 years old. They called him Big Rob. So the search went out for Big Rob. He was captured. He was arrested and he was brought to jail. Now, one of the things that happened to Rob Edwards, unfortunately, was while he was in jail, a mob descended on the jail, broke into the jail, attacked him with a crowbar, dragged his body outside, dragged him around the town square for a while, and then hung him from a lamppost. And then all of the people who were present pulled out shotguns and shot into his body until it was basically unrecognizable. So while Rob was lynched, there still were some other members who were accused of being a part of this vicious assault of this woman and the physical attack. They were arrested as well. They were tried, they were sentenced and decided to be tried by a court in Cummings, Georgia. So a lot of things started occurring at this time. Things started getting really leery for Black people. Some of the communities where they lived in were being attacked. So the trial was relatively quickly. Okay, 2 young men were sentenced, tried, and found guilty. Found guilty of the Meg Crow at that point. She lingered in a coma for a while and then died. So now it's also a rape and a murder. So both of these men were actually hung. Now, what's interesting is they were actually executed on the property of Dr. Ansel Strickland. He was the son of one of the largest plantation owners in Forsyth County before the Civil War. So Mr. Strickland had a property that looked like it could be perfect. The sheriff walked around, reviewed his property. He had a large pasture. He had these sloping hills that had a horseshoe field and almost had this natural look like an amphitheater. So the agreement was that the execution could be carried out, but it had to be in private. That was Georgia law. So a fence was erected to cover the part where the execution would occur. But the night before the execution, someone actually took the fences apart and burned the wood. But the execution was carried out that next day. So while these 2 men were actually hung, there was a mob of people who cheered it on. So what you see is one of the last remaining pictures of Ansel Strickland's property right after the lynching. This is known as like one of the last pictures that was taken and that was found and archived. So it was thousands of people, you know, the hanging was over, but the horror that would happen to Black people was not over yet. So now what you've got going on is African-Americans suddenly were forced to flee Forsyth County. Now let's talk about how devastating that was for them in so many ways. Okay, first there's the threat of physical violence. So you have to leave. Then there's the biggest danger of losing your property. Remember, 58 of the people, of the families in Forsyth County, of the African-American families, they owned their land. So that was a horror story. Out of the 58 who owned their land, 24 of them were able to actually sell it, but at a very low ball offer. Whatever they were offered, they took it. You didn't have many choices. The mobs are telling you, we be willing to buy your land. This is how much we're offering you, and you don't have a choice, you leave. So a lot of those people left. But the other 34, it was even worse. They literally walked away from everything they ever worked for. And remember, a lot of these families, they were just a generation out of slavery. Some of their parents are slaves and sharecroppers. And so they lived a dream that they thought almost impossible at one point, to become landowners. And then this horrific event occurred, and it forced African Americans out of the city. So some researchers did some work at the old Forsyth County Courthouse to just take a look at some of the deeds and bill of sales to find out exactly, well, what happened to the land after these African Americans left? And what they were able to find out were all kinds of horrible atrocities associated with not just being forced to leave, not only being forced to move away from a land that you knew and were proud of, but they lost so much money. Morgan Strickland bought a 40-acre tract in 1910, but in 1954, M.O. Terry had no problem selling Strickland's land and pocketing the proceeds. Now, there is absolutely no document whatsoever that Morgan Strickland sold his property. And you had other cases like that. One of the worst was a landowner who had just bought his property in 1912 for $1,500. He literally, 1 week later, he had to sell that property for $500 and run for his life. And so we had several stories like that were going on throughout the South. Alex Hunter, who just 3 months before the expulsion, brought a farm for $1,500. Faced with death or leaving, he sold it in December 1912 for $550. And that's the case I just mentioned. You had a Black woman, Martha Bailey. She bought 40 acres along with the Dawson-Forsyth County line in 1905 for $300. There is no record she ever sold the land. In 1913, William A. Godfrey, a white man, was now paying the taxes. So this was occurring throughout Forsyth, that the land was being seized. There were legal terms and legal techniques that landowners could use to seize the property. One was called adverse possession, where if a property has been abandoned, a new owner has the opportunity to pay the taxes on it, and then after so many years, that property becomes theirs. So that occurred a lot. So in all, 58 proud Black landowners lost their land in 1912. And many of the workers on farms and on factories, they were forced out of town too. There was a bricklaying company in Cummings, Georgia. A mob approached the workers there and told them they had to leave. So 11 Black men just left, walked off the job and ran for their lives. So now let's move forward. Let's move a bit forward. Let's move to the development of the Great Lake Lanier. So in the 1940s, the Army Corps of Engineers decided to do something more with the waterways. One of the things they did in Georgia was to build the Beaufort Dam. Now, they had four goals for this. Number one, flood control. Is there a way to redirect that water away from property so it doesn't destroy livestock, crops, damage to property, and so on and so forth? The second one, navigation. Is there a way to control the water so that whatever types of items they are floating through the water, they could get it to where they wanted to go? And then number three, actually drinking water for the town of Atlanta. So what they decided to do was to build some type of water purification infrastructure, and with that have water for the town. And then the fourth one, amazingly, wasn't part of the original plan and became very popular: recreation. Lake Lanier will become one of the most popular destinations in Georgia, and still is to this day. Of course, outside of the multiple sightings of ghosts and goblins and other supernatural. Okay. So all of this was named after the great poet Sidney Lanier, who wrote hymns and of the marshes. And then suddenly we have this incredible lake, Lake Lanier. Now there's no talk of Oscarville. So when the Corps of Engineers bought the family out that actually resided on Oscarville property, the families were actually able to move into other locations. Some of them, unfortunately, through eminent domain, lost their land, but they did get a payout. This may have been an opportunity to probably find out who originally owned the lands and probably pay them off, but that never happened. There was no mention of them. So in 1956, all of that property eventually was moved. The water filled. It took about 6 years for Lake Lanier to fill, but a lot of the items, like some grave sites, an old bridge, the old wells that they couldn't move, those are still underwater, Lake Lanier, along with the city of Oscarville, or most of it. So it's, again, this is a popular vacation site. In Georgia, one of the most popular areas to recreate in the state. Then let's go fast forward. Now, one of the things that didn't occur in Forsyth County was during the civil rights movement of the 60s, there were no protest marches. There was no request to integrate lunch counters or any of those things, because those things were totally segregated and you hardly had any Black people living there anyway. So let's move forward to the 80s, 1986 specific. So one of the leaders in Forsyth County who knew Martin Luther King wanted to do an actual march into downtown Forsyth to protest the continued conditions, what they felt was like a forced invisible segregation. So the leader of that movement actually got a lot of threats in Forsyth. So some of the civil rights activists in Atlanta decided to take it over and continue to march anyway. So some of these civil rights marchers and activists were involved in many of the movements throughout Georgia and Alabama, and even down in Birmingham, Alabama for many, many years. So they did have the experience. So they marched into Forsyth County in 1986, and they were met by mobs of people who threw stones at them and jeered and hurled racial epithets, and it was unbelievable, the attacks they were exposed to. So another march would follow. And then on the Oprah Winfrey show, she would do a special presentation on Forsyth and actually go down into the county and interview some of the people to talk about foresight. And it was an amazing experience. Some of them shared that they were ashamed that this shouldn't be happening in the county. And then there were others who were just actually proud of the fact that it was a quote unquote lily white county and he wanted it to stay that way. So there were 20,000 who marched on Forsyth County the second time. And many of these people were really well known. You had Hosea Williams, who's a prominent civil rights activist who helped lead the march. Later, Coretta Scott King would even join them. And it was relatively successful in a sense that it just brought attention to Forsyth County. Then in 1987, the governor of Georgia decided to impanel a biracial coalition to address some of the issues that led to the march. So he chose some civil rights activists from Atlanta and some community members from Forsyth County. And their goal was to come with a plan to address what they thought was systemic racism, the fact that there were no affirmative action programs in existence, and some of the racism that occurred in the past. So the coalition worked together, and unfortunately, they never came to a truce. So there were several reports, one from one side of the coalition, one from the other, and neither were able to make amends or get anything to happen. So here's Forsyth County today. And as we know, Forsyth County changed dramatically over the years. We saw the installation of 400. We saw that make it easy to commute from other areas. And now you can get from Buckhead and go straight to Alpharetta and up to Forsyth County in some of those areas. Very modernized. It's much more demographic, even though the number of African Americans is small. And then very recently, some church members in Forsyth County decided to put together a scholarship fund for the survivors of the 1912 racial expulsion. So I have this on this page, and you can see the actual website where you can access it. So if you know members who are descendants of the families that were expelled from Forsyth County, Georgia in 1912, here you have a site you can go to, and the scholarships are worth $10,000 each. So this would be probably the first time in which some type of reparations was offered for the expulsion. During 1987, when you had that biracial coalition, that was their job to try to figure out how could they resolve some of the issues of the past. And this happened very recently too. So I could not be a good librarian if I did not recommend some really good books that are available for use. One of the first is Blood at the Root, A Racial Cleansing in America by Patrick Phillips. Patrick Phillips does some in-depth research into Forsyth County, and he writes a lot about all of the occurrences that led to the 1912 expulsion and the aftermath of that as the years unfolded. And then eventually there was that biracial coalition trying to resolve it. Some of the information I just shared about the scholarship, that actually happened after his book was published. Then there's Gwinnett County, Georgia, and the Transformation of the American South. If you like something that's a very vigorous history of Gwinnett County, here is a must read. Buried in the Bitter Water, the hidden history of racial cleansing in America. What the author does is he actually reviews several cities throughout the country in which racial cleansing incidents actually happen. So in what you'll find in reading this book is that it wasn't uncommon as we might think. These occurrences were happening more rapidly than we can imagine. Then there's Lake Lanier, a storybook, the early history and construction of the Beaufort Dam, very in-depth. Now, some of these books, let me be clear, some of these books will not include information about the incident that happened in Forsyth County, Oscarville, Georgia. But if you need information about the origin of the Beaufort Dam and then Lake Lanier, these are outstanding books to read. Underwater Ghost Towns of North Georgia was a fascinating book that I would put on the reading list. Then we have Capital Men. We talked about the first African-American congressman in American history. Here's a book that details their lives and how they actually made it to higher levels of government in the country. And then here's some others, Blood Kin. And I have to share Slavery by Another Name. I spoke earlier about the convict leasing system in Georgia. Well, Slavery by Another Name, which was a National Book Award winner, a national bestseller, the re-enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil World War II. Douglas Blackman writes about that experience, how Southern states use convict labor to actually essentially re-enslave men and women and have them working in mining camps, on capital works projects, on plantations again. It's a very, very good book. It is a must read. And let me also mention, here's a gentleman who wrote a play entitled The Land, and that's The Land, L-E-N apostrophe. Okay. So The Land is a fictionalized version of the African-American men and women who were actually redistributed the land down in Savannah, Georgia, and it was 400,000 acres. It's a fascinating play that was on Broadway during the 1940s. And I hope that it's reignited, because it's a very fast-paced, fast-moving story. When you think about what did those people do when President Andrew Johnson came into office, rescinded the Special Field Order 15, the 40 acres of a mule, what was it like? He gives us a fictional account of exactly what happened when these people were told you had to give up the land. And his name, I'm sorry, is Theodore Ward, and he was a popular playwright. Here's some other books. Wilmington's Lie, which, by the way, is the winner of the Pulitzer Prize, The Murderous Coup of 1898 and the Rise of White Supremacy. So here's another book that's similar to what we're talking about, in that here's a case where a mob basically did a coup in 1898 in Wilmington. And it essentially ran out a lot of the Black politicians and their white supporters, and he literally just elected themselves into office. And then there's The Color of Law, a forgotten history of how a government segregated America, and Tulsa, The Land and the Forgotten. And here's something else that happened I thought was amazing. The NAACP, during the 1912 expulsion, sent a reporter who worked for the Crisis magazine, which was, and I think it still is, the literary journal of the NAACP. And this was the very first piece of journalism outside of the state to come in, investigate, and do a story. So the Cherokee Fires is the story about that investigation. And I'll stop here and thank you. We greatly appreciate you coming out to this, and we will open the floor to some questions, because I will be happy to answer any. And thank you for this presentation, because it was an exciting project to do. And for years, I had wondered whatever happened to the people from Forsyth, Georgia, who were the residents of Oscarville, Georgia, and how did suddenly that prosperous town end up under the Lake Lanier?
Ron, that was a great presentation, quite comprehensive. You cover so many periods of time, and really emphasize what often had happened in the past in places like Oscarville, Tulsa, Rosewood. It is truly unfortunate. We see the loss of land and business and employment, the loss of intergenerational transfer of wealth, which still affects our community today, the African-American community and the larger community. That old Faulkner quote, it's always appropriate, right? The past is never dead. It's not even the past, right? Exactly. So thank you for this presentation. I'm looking forward to the questions. And hopefully we have some coming in.
I see 4. Do you see them? If you pull the questions, I'll answer whatever you send to me.
Okay. First, I want to note that there is someone here, I guess, from the scholarship committee, from the Forsyth Scholarship Committee, who's following the program. And so people are interested in gaining information about that. Fortunately, someone's here, and I think they put that information in the chat. Also, there was a question of who was the Oscar of Oscarville? What businesses were in the town, and are you aware of any of the descendants?
So there was a special presentation where some journalists actually interviewed the descendants. So News One, there were some other newspapers where they were interviewed in Forsyth County. So that information is there. And the descendants actually talk about their experiences doing the research, actually going to the Forsyth County Courthouse to pretty establish ownership to land that they felt they should have inherited. So many descendants are out there and they are telling their stories too. I've not met any of them, but I've actually read some of their interviews and I've watched them televised also during the interviews. So they are there. I hope that they would connect with the Forsyth Scholarship Committee, or Forsyth Scholarship Committee, to know that there is something that's available and whatever else it is they plan to do. But they're absolutely descendants and they are doing some research into this, trying to find out exactly what was the results. Because remember, 58 landowners, there were 58. 34 of those people who owned their land outright, they never got a dime for their property. And those who were forced to sell, they made a very small, a lowball offer. They had to take it and run for their lives. So I think there was a journalist who said he didn't think that that could be a lawsuit. It's too late. I'm not a lawyer, definitely not. But as a researcher, I'll tell you, I think the information is there that the descendants you need to look at that information and talk to somebody.
Okay. And we have another question where a viewer asks, can you give a bit more detail about how Lake Lanier covers Oscarville?
Okay, excellent question. So Lake Lanier, remember, it took 5 years to fill up the entire Lake Lanier. It doesn't cover the entirety of Oscarville, but it covers the bulk of it. There is some land that's occupied now where you have homeowners. That's a part of Oscarville, but I can't give you the full dimensions because they're still doing research to determine what exactly was fully Oscarville. What part of that was farmland? It was livable, what people resided there versus Liverville, maybe timberland and woods and so on and so forth. So research is still being done to find out exactly where was it. But the bulk of it is under Lake Lanier.
Someone else referred to the what happened in California with Bruce's Beach and how the property was given back or some arrangement was made so that the family did benefit from the property. And they're asking, do you ever see Georgia doing something, I guess, along those lines to acknowledge the people of Oscarville?
Excellent question. I'll tell you what I do see. I do see that the descendants of this need to do their research. They need to get out there to the Forsyth County Courthouse, if they've not done it already, pull that information about the property, about what should have been an inheritance maybe, and then follow up with that information. Because the interviews I'm seeing, there's some complaints from the descendants, and they're explaining that, okay, they got a raw deal, which they did. But what I'm not hearing yet, and hopefully we'll hear, is why don't you go to the next step now? You need to follow up on this. What can you do? Remember, there was an attorney who was interviewed by a journalist, and he felt adamantly that there's nothing you can do. I tend as a non-attorney to disagree. I think there's a lot you can do. From some of the research that I've done and the information I've seen, it's all there. The owner of the property, the time the property was lost, the time the property was purchased, the mere fact that there was never a bill of sales that transitioned it from the owner to anybody else. And then years later, you find someone else is selling that property. So the information is there. And I speak as a researcher librarian. So I don't know. It's not like I disagree with the attorney, but I'll say you need to do some digging and follow up with it. And I do see something happening. I do see more happening. One of the schools in Forsyth County also was renamed recently after a Black school that was in Oscarville, Georgia in 1912. So we've seen some kinds of small little moves to try to right the wrong, but more needs to be done, sure.
And someone asked, how would someone go about proving, I lost the question. It moved around. How would someone go about proving that they belong to the lineage of a descendant of Oscarville? What information or verification does the scholarship application require? So that might be more of a question for that committee. I don't know if you would know that one, but if you do.
Yeah, definitely for the committee. And it sounds like a genealogy workshop class you should attend and do some research. So I would say if you think you're a descendant of someone from Oscarville, Georgia in 1912, do your research to find out. What's great about our library, the Gwinnett County Public Library, is we do have genealogical resources available, so we can start you on that search. We even do classes available on genealogy. We have one class that's really popular on African-American genealogy. So that's one place to start. And then the other is someone's here from the scholarship. That is a question you could ask them, but use the resources that are available and find out. Do you have a great uncle? Do you have a great grandfather who was there? And the information is available. The names of the people who own that property, those 58 property owners, their names are available. You can find all of that at the Forsyth County Courthouse. That's where some of the research is founded. And I double checked the work that they used before I brought it to you. So it's available. You can definitely find that out.
Unmute myself. Next question is, what are some of the ghost stories that have been told that you have heard?
Oh my goodness, there are many ghost stories. So in the 1950s, there were two young college students who were driving on a highway and they were never seen again. Then later, many people were saying there were sightings of someone in this blue dress floating around in the water, and you can feel them actually pulling you below the surface. Some years after that, an abandoned car was found, and it did have bodies of individuals who have been there for many, many years. So the reality of, well, I don't know about the reality of ghosts. Again, I'll hire a team of Ghostbusters to help me with that. But there's certain stories of multiple sightings. There's a grave site that's still under Lake Lanier. Now, many of those were interned initially when the Corps of Engineers decided to use that land to use better use of the water. Some of those remain that they couldn't remove, or they didn't get permission from the parents to remove those, or the family members or whatever. So they remain. So there is that story that it's haunted, that those are the ghosts of the dead. And now the story is those are the spirits of the people from Oscarville, Georgia in 1912.
And apparently there was news about a movie being made about Oscarville and Lake Lanier. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, from what I've heard, there is sort of a mini series being made for television. I forgot the name of the company. I'm not sure when it will be released, but you can do a search and you can find some updates on exactly what's happening. Do Oscarville, Georgia, made for TV, and you can see that they're putting something together. I just hope that they get it right. I like fiction, I like movies, but I like when we get as close to historical accuracy as we possibly can. So they hope they do a really good job, because we've got descendants of these people who are still out here, and they need to actually address this.
Okay. Question, was the real culprit of the attack on the woman ever found?
Now, here's something interesting that you said that. No, but during the trial of two of the men, one of the men's sisters was actually encouraged, and we think some people said in some of these articles I read, possibly threatened to testify against the three men. So she testified, and this is a story, that she met Rob. He came to her house and told her he attacked someone and left her on a road. So Rob, his brother-in-law, and his cousin, and she went out to the site where the woman's body was. Her story's claim was that as she held the lamplight, they took turns ravaging the young woman's body, and then they left. Now, her attorney was astonished because she had never told him any of this. But a day before the trial, she was visited by one of the prosecutors and the sheriff, and her story changed. And it may have been simply that this is a way to save yourself because they won't survive this. One of them is already dead. He's been lynched. His body been dragged around the town square, hung from a light pole, and shot 100 times. These two men will be executed. So I'm thinking, I'm not sure, but many of the authors think that, of course, she was threatened to do that. But for those people in the courtroom, that's the story you believed anyway. So now here's a witness telling you exactly what happened. But if you think in terms of reality, would they be that bold to commit this type of act? When Rob Love came to this property and told them, I just assaulted somebody, I bashed her in the head with a rock and I left on the road. Let's go back and finish her off. Okay, I'll leave it to the imagination. But she did testify, and she was eventually released and just disappeared from Forsyth.
Okay. And someone asked about whether or not, I guess, Roy Barnes, former Governor Roy Barnes, is representing the residents
In a current case.
that relocated to Roswell.
Okay, not familiar with that part. Not sure. I'm not sure about that, but I know that quite a few things are occurring now. I'm proud to see about the foundation that occurred to provide the fellowship. The scholarships, and also I'm very excited that one of the schools is named after the African American school in Oscarville, Georgia, because surprisingly they had a very functional school. The kids were literate. The parents were property owners, and those who worked hard. There were no problems in quiet little Oscarville until that incident. And there were incidents before that, but I wanted to focus for this presentation strictly on the May Crow assault. But there was an assault 1 week before that on a Michelle Grice, and that's another story that's behind it. But this incident occurred, and it changed the lives of everybody for, my goodness, for many, many years. But no, I'm not sure of this possible endeavor that's happening with the governor.
Okay. And I see that there are some questions in chat. I've been pulling them primarily from the question and answer box. So I'm going back in chat to see if there were any that I missed. And if you put it in chat, could you go ahead and put it in question and answer? And I apologize if I missed it.
And I'll see while we're thinking about this, of all of the books that I recommended, they're available at your Gwinnett County Public Library.
Yes, and that was one of the questions.
Just so if you don't have your library card, it's an easy process to get a library card. And what's amazing is if you ever try to find a book where we don't have, and the book is a year or older, we can obtain that book for you through our library loan program. It's called Interlibrary Loan. And what we will do is find that book at libraries throughout the state. If it's not available, we'll go throughout the country and we'll find that book for you. So we want you to get the resources. Most of those that are listed, we do have at the library because I actually consulted those. So it's available. Get that library card. And remember, genealogy databases, we have that free for you.
Okay. And I'm still looking. There are quite a few.
Good. Awesome. I'm so glad everybody's interested in this topic. I was excited when I started doing the research.
Oh, I think, okay, here's a question. I'm familiar, of course, with some of the fine work done by the Equal Justice Initiative. One question was, has the soil has been collected? There's a question, I guess, about the soil and the marker by the Equal Justice Initiative. So is there a marker there?
The soil has been collected. From what I understand, I think there is a marker and it has been installed by some officials at Forsyth County. I could double check that, but from what last I read, they were planning to do it. And there was a specific date, so I think it did happen.
Okay, and I am aware that in a number of counties throughout Georgia, there have been efforts to collect soil and place markers. So other questions? I'm trying to catch everything. There's so many.
Great.
A lot of interest in this topic.
Well, for a long time, this was not talked about much. Many people didn't know that this incident occurred. Remember when Lake Lanier was being dredged and the Beaufort Dam, there was no conversation about it. We don't even know for sure if the people who owned the property in Oscarville at that time knew its origins. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But we know that when the government gave them a payout, because they did pay them out, even those they had to forcibly remove through eminent domain, they were paid to leave that property and they left. But I think that was a great opportunity anyway to, if anything else, make this right. That was the opportunity to find those owners and try to make this right. But there was no mention of them doing this. And if you read some of the books that I've recommended to you about the origin of Lake Lanier, some of them I mentioned earlier won't even mention it. It's not even part of the subject, but it gives you information about how the Corps of Engineers made this happen and relocated the families that were currently inheriting that land.
A question about whether the Forsyth families that settled in Beaufort, or do you know anything about the Forsyth families that settled in Beaufort and worked in the tanning industry? And I think there was also some research about some of the Oscarville or Forsyth families that settled in Hall
Gaines.
County and knew the poultry industry.
Absolutely,
Do
absolutely.
you know
So
anything about that?
yes, yes, absolutely. In fact, one of the claims is that it became known as the poultry capital of the country because a large number of African Americans from Oscarville, Georgia, who had experience in that industry, would flee and build their lives anew in some of the counties where that was really popular, Gainesville, Hall County, and some of the other areas. So that was very true. Some of them fled to Atlanta. And for many of them, they just fled throughout the country. So some of them thought perhaps bigger cities were safer, but I would say 1906, I don't think Atlanta was as safe as one would want it to be, but they were just fleeing for their lives and they had to start over. And I think that's what's fascinating about it is wasn't just one case. This was more common than people can imagine. You had Rosewood. We talk about all of these other cities that are prominently known to have been parts of racial expulsions, but there are others we don't know anything about. Oscarville is relatively new, and this occurred in 1912, and this was a major loss to, again, the descendants of ex-slaves who finally found a way to get a foothold and own land.
And there's also a question about, do you know about other drowned towns in America? And I think the person said that they heard something about Central Park and its reservoir in New York, for example, and that there was a black town there, I guess, where people were driven out. Do you know anything about that?
I do know that there are definitely other drowned towns, but what I could do as a librarian researcher is let me find specific information and make that available. And who knows, maybe that could be a follow-up presentation. I don't know, but it's something I definitely would like to research because there are many of them. I was shocked by the number of racial expulsions that occurred throughout the country from around the turn of the century all the way up to like the 1920s. Absolutely fascinated by that. So there were many. But I would be delighted as a library researcher to find out, to see what we have about that. But I don't know enough in detail to share that with you, but I do know that it did occur. And let your librarian get to work for you. I'll find out.
Someone said Lake Murray in South Carolina may be an example, and that the creation of some of the interstate highways are kind of similar cases. Another question that came up a couple of times, I don't think I asked you, was people are asking, I guess, who was Oscar? You know, Oscarville, who's the Oscar that Oscarville is named after or was named after?
Very
Didn't know
good
anything about
question.
that.
Let me research that for you because I do not know. I just know when the town sort of originated and that it was a good town that worked and African Americans functioned very well there, in spite of the fact that you had all of these, the backsliding from the civil rights gains the radical Republicans made happen in the country during Reconstruction. So after 12 years of Reconstruction, suddenly it's gone. We got all these amazing gains. But let me find out who is it named after. I'm wondering if it's one of the leaders in that town because you had several of those. Churches also were destroyed. Churches, schools, homes, everything. If you read some of the newspaper accounts and you do those primary sources carefully, you can get day to day. It's sort of what I did with the AJC and some other newspapers to get a day to day of exactly what was happening. And it was absolutely horrible, almost indescribable.
And someone has said that Oscar was the postmaster.
Mm.
So that might be what you find when you do the research.
Awesome. Let me find out because I would like to know. That's interesting. And the article I sent to you by the NAACP, that's available. I can make that available to you. And remember, that was a crisis magazine. Journalists went out to interview. The journalist was a white man, so he was able to really quietly integrate into the community. So he could get the story from some of the people who actually experienced this, even some of the participants in that incident. So that story is available too. That's the Crisis Magazine. It was published actually in 1915, but it's a really in-depth story. And it was the only one that I can find, or some of the researchers could find, by a national newspaper or journal.
And someone has asked if it's true that the UGA campus sits on land that was a successful Black town.
Well, let's say we would like to find out. That's what some researchers do. I think what happened with this incident, which is really helpful, is it spurred interest in finding out where did these towns that were vacated suddenly through racial terror, where are they? How did it happen? And the racial expulsions, what happened to the people? How much did they lose? I think Oscarville is so amazing because you could almost be specific in how much was lost because the information is there. You've got the names of the landowners. You've got the bill of sale. You've got the deeds to the estates. Everything is there. And you've got the proof that many of them, when they were forced off the land, there was never a sale by them, but they were sold by other individuals later. So that one's a really strong case because the information is there. And I'm willing to bet you through some research, we can find many more of these. I would not be surprised.
Yeah, this is I mean, this all speaks to the tragedy of what happened to African Americans. Even up into easily up into the late 60s, early 1970s, where there was simply no citizenship rights, and all the things that typically in America, we encourage people to do, to work hard, to get education, to join the military, to buy land. It didn't work for Black people. It just didn't work in many instances. And in fact, if you did well in those areas, you were usually a target. So this is, again, a reminder of what a challenge has been to make us a more perfect union. And we have made progress. You can never say that, progress hasn't been made. But when you think about, how long, right, and what was lost, and how the loss of the transfer, this intergenerational wealth transfer affects things today. It's good that we're learning more and more about this.
Sure. And we're finding cases where if you look deep into history, you'll realize there were these amazing advancements in terms of African-American civil rights, and then these extraordinary backsliding, just amazing. You take, for instance, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. That should have done everything. We're free. It's great. And all of those were circumvented. All of those amendments to the Constitution involving civil rights, they were circumvented with the legislation that came out in the 1890s. In 1875, you had the Civil Rights Act, powerful one. There were several Civil Rights Act that came out of Reconstruction. And then Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, would literally overtop that. And we would not see another Civil Rights Act until 1964. So there was progress, and then there was backsliding. And I was sharing that with the students so they could understand exactly what happened. We go from Reconstruction, then we go to the New South. So all of those rights are essentially gone. You've got all of these now, these man-made state level, local level laws to circumvent anything that was successful for African Americans. And if you think about it, this stayed around for a long time. In 1941, Thurgood Marshall would file a successful lawsuit that was argued in the Supreme Court about the all-white primaries, and he won in 1944. Right. But look how long that took. 1944, I remember reading an article, and the headline stated, "This is the second emancipation." That's how the people felt in the community. So you saw a lot of that going on, and it still, I think, happens today, my research shows. But when something progresses, I guess it's up to the people to ensure that it doesn't backslide.
Sure.
And I do the final reminder, please use your library card and use your public library. We've got genealogical resources. So if you need to do that research, good. And here's what's great. We got library staff, trained, talented, and we'll be happy to help you with whatever you need, sir. So any of those 15 branches you go to, you've got staff there trained and ready to help you. So utilize us. I'm excited to do some more research and bring you more information about this. I like the idea of finding out exactly what those other towns were that was suddenly vacated, maybe covered by infrastructure and property, and what happened to those people.
Well, Ron, this has been just an outstanding presentation. I think we all learned so much, and it's another reminder of what a wonderful resource Gwinnett County libraries are. You can learn about anything and everything, and the expertise that you guys provide and your ability to direct us to what we need to learn about anything is just amazing. So I am just happy to know you and so many that work with you there and throughout the county. This has been great, and I'm sure everybody's looking forward to the next one.
Well, we'll be delighted. We love serving the public. And if you have some research presentation ideas, you can send it to us anytime, and we'll be happy to try to put something together for you.
Okay. Well, with that, I believe we will bring our program to an end. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. And again, follow the Gwinnett County Public Library website to see upcoming authors and events, and just all the wonderful books and periodicals and online databases that you have access to as a result of being a citizen in this great county, Gwinnett County. So once again, thank you for joining us this evening. Have a good evening.
Thank
Good
you.
night.